Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming to the Education Center's Brown Bag Lunch. This isn't exactly an education issue, but the person that is presenting today is a very special person from the Education Policy Center, and I'll just explain that briefly. We have an intern project here at the Independence Institute, or an intern program. And Stephen applied for the internship, and we approved him, and he worked with us in the Education Center. And by the way, I'm Pam Benigno, the director of the Education Policy Center, and Ben DeGrow, our senior education policy analyst, is standing up in the back. And so Stephen was from our guest speaker. Stephen at the time had been raised most of his life in Colorado Springs, and he was in Austin at the University of Texas working on his Ph.D. when we had the privilege of having him as an intern. And he wrote a paper called Bad Choices Bring Bad Times, and you can find that on our website. And actually, Stephen, just in the last 2 weeks, there's been 2 instances where I've thought about your paper. And he reported on the 2006 report, Tough Choices or Tough Times, and some of you in education policy are aware of that. And part of that project encourages a German model of education, and Stephen was the perfect person with his background in education to tackle that particular policy document and critique it. So you might want to take a look at that. So now he's finished with all of his exams in his PhD program, and his field will be political theory, and he is working on his dissertation, and during this process he's been teaching classes and writing academic journal articles. And so today he's going to be presenting from one of his academic journal articles. And I did make a few copies, not one for everyone, but as you leave, if you'd like one, you can pick one up. And if we run out, then I'll be sure you get one. So I just wasn't sure that everybody would want or need a copy of it. So I would like to introduce to you Stephen Pittz as our guest today.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. It's nice to be back at the Independence Institute, and as Pam said, first time I was here in 2007, and I was working on my PhD then, and it's 2012, and I'm still working on my PhD. And the other thing she didn't say is, she didn't mention my attire, and the Broncos colors are deliberate, both because they're my favorite team, and I have to wish them luck. And it's also a bit of an insurance policy. That's, if you come to think that my presentation isn't all that good, I have a feeling that subconsciously you'll still have a favorable impression of me when you leave. So, but now that I've said enough about myself, I'd like to say a few things about Alexis de Tocqueville before getting into the presentation. By just a show of hands, just curious, how many of you are familiar with Tocqueville? And how many have read some of him? I would guess it'd be Democracy in America. So, yeah, quite a few of you. So that's good. I think one reason I chose this paper to present here is I think that Tocqueville, more than the other political philosophers, political theorists that I study, really has something to say to people who are in politics, and is interesting to read, especially for Americans. And one reason for that is he's less abstract than your other big name political philosophers like Plato or Kant. These guys that are very abstract, very theoretical. He's a lot less abstract. And this is probably due in large part to the fact that he was a public official for 20 years of his life. No one really hears about this because his writings were so famous. He wrote what many people say might be the best book ever on democracy, but he actually still, while he was doing that, you'd think a guy like that might focus all his energies on writing and research. but he felt very strongly that public service and actually being in the active political life was important. Another reason you don't hear about him, he's actually really ineffective as a politician. He very, very little success. And in fact, when he went to America to write Democracy in America, it's alleged that he was leaving France. He was leaving France to go study the American prison system. But allegedly that was a pretense to get out of France because he had made so many enemies on both the left and the right, and he really just didn't had any political support. But in any case, this is one reason why I think Tocqueville's interesting for not just academics, but people in politics as well, or people just interested in politics. And the other way he's different than some of these other philosophers who are very abstract is that he really does start with observations about the world and then builds his theories from those. He really looks to his real life experience and then tries to build theories off of it. And he's really, really insightful, very, very keen powers of observation, and really insightful. And I would say that of any book that I've ever read as a Ph.D. student in government that I would recommend to people in America, it'd be Democracy in America. It's a really fun book to read. Lots of the stuff he says in there is really insightful and comes true, and you're kind of amazed that he said it 200 years ago. By the way, just to put him in a time perspective, he lived from 1805 to 1859. So he's right there, born about 20 years after the French Revolution, or 16 years. Okay, so today what I want to talk about is the relationship that Tocqueville builds, and it's actually between two works, Democracy in America and his later work, The Old Regime and the Revolution, which is his description or theory about what happened during the French Revolution. Between these two books, we see an interesting connection being made between a moral belief in equality and the fact of administrative centralization. So government power being centralized, and I mean what we can say kind of shorthand is bureaucratic administration. And so I'm going to look at both of these two books and show how these come together. But before I do that, I want to say one reason Tocqueville is so important for us today is that he is really the theorist of equality, of the idea of equality. Now, this might not seem particularly interesting to us or important to us, but one thing that I do because I'm studying political theory is it really does start 500 BC and come up to the present day, and you're kind of always thinking in terms of like the whole scale of Western political history. And so from that perspective, Tocqueville actually occupies a small place in the eras where belief in human equality is very high. It's taken for granted, it's a given. Yet, throughout the course of political history, that's not the case. And definitely not even in France in Tocqueville's time, there were still residues, you could say, sort of like an aristocratic residue. And equality hadn't firmly taken hold yet. But Tocqueville sees this belief in human equality, and he realizes this is actually the foundation of a whole new way of looking at politics for the rest of time. He really believed that a whole new political science was necessary for this era in which humans were all believed to be equal. So what I'm going to talk about today is this relationship between equality and the concentration of power in the central government. First, I'm going to go a little ahead in Tocqueville's life. He wrote The Old Regime and the Revolution, which was his take on what happened in the the French Revolution. And he wrote it in 1856, just a few years before he died. And he wrote this book after extensive research in French government archives. And he really tried to prove that while the revolution was supposedly this victory for equality and liberty and fraternity and throwing off the central monarch who was a despotic ruler, it really didn't happen that way. What happened was the monarchy had started to consolidate power in the central government in Paris for a whole range of 200 years over a whole range of issues before the revolution happened. And in fact, this is what caused the revolution. It wasn't this, kind of beautiful uprising of people in the name of liberty. That was kind of the very last gasp. But what happened was this centralization of power over a course of 200 years that actually got people in France to start believing in human equality. And that sounds sort of counterintuitive, but I think we can see how that happens. So first I'm going to talk about how government centralization leads to a belief in equality in France. So for 2 centuries preceding the abolition of the monarchy in France in 1789, the king had gradually expanded the central power through his King's Council. There were 6 major areas over which the Royal Council, through its intendants, gradually increased its control. These were taxation, military conscription, public works, public order, the judiciary, and welfare. Now, I'm not going to bore you guys with a bunch of details about these things, but these were the major areas. And one thing I should mention is at the end of the talk, Pam has printed out a number of copies of the paper, and it's much more detailed in there if you are interested. But I don't want to go into those details too much here. But there's all these 6 areas where central government is expanding. But how did this actually lead up to the revolution? And more importantly, to a belief in equality? There are 3 ways in which it did this. The first way is that government became the same everywhere, and its prevalence inculcated a strong belief in its power and effectiveness. The pervasiveness of the central government was keenly felt by citizens in distant towns, engendering a strong belief that only the central power was capable of accomplishing necessary tasks. Government paternalism was everywhere, and I have a good way to illustrate this in a letter that Tocqueville finds from a farmer, a regional rural farmer, that he writes to a government official, and this is about 150 years after the central government of Paris had started to kind of extend its fingers. So this farmer writes to a government official, "Why doesn't the government name inspectors who would go into the provinces once a year to see the state of the crops, who would teach the farmers how to improve them, who would tell them what to do with their animals, how to fatten them, raise them, sell them, and where one ought to market them? These inspectors ought to be well paid." Now, this seems a little strange, doesn't it? You've got a farmer, ostensibly from a long line of farmers, who's been doing this for generations. They're the ones that have the knowledge of this craft. They're the ones that know what they're doing. But this is the way that people start to relate to government when it starts to spread too far. He's asking for government inspectors to come and help him out in a way that you would imagine these government people don't have any ability to do. Why would they even know how to do this? They've been living in Paris. They're probably from a long line of government officials that lived in Paris. Why would they have any experience with this? Okay, so that's the first way, is that government became the same everywhere. Its power seemed to grow. People started to look to it more for all kinds of things. The second way in which this expansion of central government power led to equality is that there was a belief in the central authority that shaped ideas, habits, and mores, and caused citizens to seek not only security and welfare from the government, but opinion and thought as well. Tocqueville notes how Paris had become more and more the only teacher of France. A nice way to illustrate this is what traveler and writer Arthur Young, who traveled all around France visiting small towns and writing little historical pieces about them. He wrote of all the small towns of France at the time, this is about 50 years before the Revolution, that, quote, "These people do not even dare have an opinion until they know what people think in Paris." And we certainly see similar things happen like this today, that, places like the coast, LA and New York, and big media and cultural centers tend to have a perhaps disproportionate influence over the rest of the country. And this was happening in France at the time as well. Okay, so finally, the third way in which centralization led to equality is that it closed the gap between the nobles and the bourgeois, rendering the classes nearly indistinguishable. So prior to the Revolution, and prior to this expansion of central government power, you've got the nobles who basically have their own little governments set up on their land, the land that they own. And then you had the bourgeois, which is kind of middle-class people living in cities, maybe merchants, craftsmen, people who are making a living that way, but they don't have land, so they don't have their own political power. But what happened is the nobles started giving their land away more and more because the government was coming in and just taking care of more functions that they were historically in charge of. And once the nobles had kind of lost their land, lost some of their political power, they decided, well, let's just move to this city and live like the bourgeois. So you've got these rich nobles who kind of turn into, their lifestyle becomes more of like a middle-class bourgeois lifestyle. So these long-standing class distinctions, which is hard for us to really understand today, but just this aristocratic difference in classes, began to fade. People didn't notice as much anymore, so people actually became to feel more equal, and there was more. So those are the three ways in which central government control led to this belief in equality. And so what I want to do now is talk about America. It's a very different place. France started with centralization, led to equality, but it had a history of aristocracy. America, on the other hand, is this great democratic experiment. Tocqueville starts out Democracy in America by saying the defining characteristic, the most important fact about America is the fact that it's the only country in the history of the world where equality of conditions actually exists. It's not some pipe dream, but it really happened. For the most part, we can say there's an equality of conditions in this country. What's going to happen when you have a democratic experiment without all this residue of class distinctions and despotism and aristocracy? And what Tocqueville finds in this book is that there's a danger. He doesn't see it coming yet. He actually writes Democracy in America partly to try to help prevent this from happening. But he sees that there's a danger of this belief in equality leading Americans also to try to concentrate government power in the center, to give a central government a lot of power. And he shows all these ways where he thinks reasons he thinks this is going to happen. So the first thing he says is that Americans' belief in equality makes its citizens pleased to imagine a great nation in which all of the citizens resemble a single model and are directed by a single power. Equality makes sympathy possible in a way that was never before seen in aristocracies. There was no innate feeling that people should be treated differently. Rather, they should all be treated the same, and it makes most sense to have them all treated the same way by a single power. And all individuals, at least in terms of their needs, are the same. So the Democrat increasingly adopts the idea of a unique right of society to take the place of the idea of a right inherent in certain individuals. Hence, there is no longer significant division in the opinions of what powers the state should have, nor is there a belief in the need for varied legislation for varied communities. In France or in other countries where we still have a little bit today, but when you have very distinct classes, you have classes with very different interests and very different beliefs on what the government should be doing. And this creates a sort of check on the power of the government to consolidate, or the ability of the government to consolidate and become very powerful, because there's just too many interests fighting it in different ways. We certainly have special interests today, but it's not exactly the same of having these really, really distinct classes. And to go a little further with what Tocqueville says about Democrats, he says, as each of them sees himself little different from his neighbors, he hardly understands why the rule that is applicable to one man should not be equally so to all others. Once power is constituted in a uniform manner, Americans imagine, so to speak, no limits to it. They willingly recognize that it has the right to do everything. Now this might seem a little bit hyperbolic, it's maybe a little exaggerated, but he's trying to tap into what this feeling of equality can do for people's thoughts about government. So the equal and isolated Democrat is vulnerable to regulation and administrative centralization due to identification with society at large. But there is another reason Democrats desire to give power to the state. That is the love of public tranquility. Now, this is based on the idea that Tocqueville believes Democrats are primarily interested in their material and physical well-being. That means they're mostly interested in having property and having goods, making sure they can take care of their material needs. This is something he sees as different than prior societies who might have had more militant or more religious direction in general. He says Democrats in general, they want public tranquility because they want to make sure they can protect the things that they have. So government is there to provide this public order, but it puts the individual Democrat in a compromised position. On the one hand, he does feel entirely capable of providing for his material well-being. Especially here in America, we have the American dream. If you work hard, you should be able to provide for yourself. There's not that many things stopping you. But there is one thing that can stop you. The Democrat knows that he personally, or his group, or his community, is too weak to guarantee a stable working environment. So he must rely on the government to provide this stable order. Just the general idea that an economy needs stability in order to do what it does. But there's a problem with this too, because different economic interest groups ask for different things. They all have a need for stability, but they might look at that in a different way. And this need for stability guides innovators and industrialists to seek special attention, attempting to draw government action to their side to help them out, all the while trying to restrict this privilege for other people, for other, perhaps, competitors. The greater the number of businessmen to ask for and receive governmental exception, the greater the role of government in what was previously a private economic sphere, and hence the greater the aggregate power of government. But there's another thing to add to this cycle. Because people believe in equality, Democrats believe in equality, they really hate the idea of anybody else, any other group, any other person being treated unequally. They hate it if somebody else seems to be getting special privileges. So, if someone is given special privileges, they want this fixed somehow. They want this rectified. But there's a problem with this. Who's the only entity, or what is the only entity that can fix this? The government. So then, you go back to the government, you lobby the government to try to rectify the problem that you could argue the government started in the first place. So throughout this whole process, more power is going to the central government. So I'm just going to give a really quick summary of what Tocqueville sees, and let's say he sees and fears happening in America. So it can be summarized accordingly. The democratic love of equality leads men to seek a sovereign that serves all subjects in an equal way. They therefore prefer uniform legislation and willingly surrender social power to the state. Economic interests in democracies lead individuals or groups to seek special treatment from government to further their own causes, and hence the central power spreads as it becomes more and more entangled with the economic endeavors of its citizens. The privileges granted to some are felt and despised by others out of their love of equality, and these citizens look to government to rectify these injustices of privilege. So this appeal to government to level the playing field now, to make it even again, in fact, gathers yet more power into the central government's hands. So it's just a continual cycle. And it's very, very, the way Tocqueville talks about this, both in the old regime of the revolution and in democracy in America, makes it seem almost impossible to counteract. It definitely doesn't leave you with a good feeling that there's ways to take care of this. Yet, he did write Democracy in America in part to try and remedy this situation, or at least provide some antidotes for it. And I want to talk a little bit about those here, but I won't go into too much detail. So there's no doubt that this spells trouble for liberty. There seems to be this partnership between equality and centralization. And this seems to pose a really, really big problem for liberty. And so he talks about a few things that can help. And I want to just name 4 of them and then talk about one of them. Tocqueville really focuses on the importance of civic associations, religious groups, and local communities to combat the power of central government. He's always trying to find ways to promote and encourage kind of small Republican self-government, and to make sure that you're taking care of as many things you can in your own backyard, so you don't have to ask for any other help, and also just to sort of instill in people that feeling of power that comes from working together and solving problems. And then religion was one that he thought was very important. He found it to be a very natural check to the spread of government, because it gave people another sense of identity and a whole other sphere of their life that was separate from government, and therefore would just naturally keep people a little more distant from it. The most important one I want to talk about today that Tocqueville was very adamant about was legislative decentralization. Legislative decentralization, and this means explicitly putting in the laws and the Constitution, making sure that you're decentralizing power over whether it's a federal system, whatever it might be. He isn't actually very clear about that, but you can tell that he wrote after the American founders. I think there's already some evidence of success in the checks and balances that the American founders had put in, and he's very much a promoter, a supporter of this, and saying this is very important. We have to make sure we continue to try to decentralize power in a legislative manner. And I wanted to read for you a quote that he has that's very telling, and I also think is very interesting. And it's about the importance of legislative decentralization. He says, "I shall admit, if one wishes, that the villages and counties of the United States would be more usefully administered by a central authority located far away from them, and that would remain foreign to them than by officials taken within them. I shall recognize, if one requires it, that more security would reign in America, that they would make a wiser and more judicious use of social resources if the administration of the whole country were concentrated in a single hand. Yet the political advantages that Americans derive from the system of decentralization would still make me prefer it to that system." So what he's saying here is that it might be more efficient. You might be more capable of getting big things done if you did have power centralized in a central monarchy or in a central government of some sort. But what we need to look at is it shouldn't be a question of just what works. It should be a question of what kind of political culture do you want to have. And when he's talking about the political advantage that Americans derive from a system of decentralization, he's talking about this ability to actually practice self-government, to actually work together to solve problems. And that he wouldn't mind seeing, a worse program in state X than state Y, because in state X, it's people on the ground, real people, real citizens who created that program. They're trying to implement it, whether it's good or not. There's so much to be taken from the actual process of governing yourself that he would prefer that to something better. And I think that's an important takeaway, and I think it's something that I'm trying to relate this to modern politics or politics right now. Is there's so much pressure, it seems to me, on politicians when they're trying to get elected. You just have to talk about what works. You build up your successes. You constantly point to this did this, this did this. You have a bunch of numbers about a program that worked here and here and here. And there's not a whole lot of emphasis on the actual practice of governing and how important it is for people to be involved in government. The whole history of republicanism, not necessarily the Republican Party, but Republican government, is this idea of self-government. And it can be at a very small level. It can be things like jury duty and PTA meetings, but they're important because they involve people in government. And there are political advantages to just doing things this way, even if they might not be the most efficient and effective way of doing something. And I think that's an important thing to take away. So I want to I think I'm going to get out of the camera here for a second. But I did just want to draw a couple graphs to just finally illustrate what Tocqueville is finding. In France, Tocqueville finds that you can have centralization and equality. And you see that it goes like this. The more of one that you have, the more of the other you have. And he also finds that you've got equality and liberty. This is what he actually states at the very beginning of Democracy in America. It's like this. The more of this you have, the less of that you're going to have. And we also could see, I'm just going to go ahead, the more centralization, the more liberty you have. The more centralization you have, the less liberty you have. This is the one that he thinks is the natural tendency. And that's the scary thing. And I think one thing I want to reiterate is that Tocqueville is not saying just that in democracies, these things, if they happen to go together in democracy, they naturally coexist. There's a certain harmony between them. It's actually worse than that. It's rather that both centralization and equality have the ability to cause and to reinforce the other one. Meaning that you can start with equality like we do in America, and you can get to centralization of power. You can get to a really strong central government. Or you can start like in France with a government that's becoming way more centralized, and then you can go to equality. So it makes this seem a lot even scarier, I think, when you think of it that way. So I think that it's more easy to think of them as just, oh, they go together, they kind of make sense, because if you want things to be equal, you want government to give more things to people, then kind of level the playing field and make it equal. But it's even more than that, because you could say that any victory for equality is also going to, in the long run, be a victory for centralization of power, and vice versa. And going back to what we're talking about politics today, it seems extra scary to me because political rhetoric is so focused in this country on equality. And I think that even Republicans are forced to use that word. I mean, and you have to distinguish between different types of equality. Certainly there's a difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. That seems to be the big divide that we always, that the political rhetoric today focuses on. But even just the use over and over again of euphemisms or talk about equality, it does, that's what I'm looking for. It strengthens this general belief in equality that what Tocqueville is showing actually has a natural tendency to result in government centralization. And I don't know if there's an answer to this. It might make me look like the totally ivory tower outside of reality academic to even think this is possible. But I'm wondering, and I just kind of wanted, before I open it up to questions, is I'm wondering if there isn't a possibility of being more careful with political language. And in the town hall debates, we heard President Obama say on several occasions that we need to level the playing field. But I also heard Governor Romney say that. I think twice. I know once. I think twice. And they clearly mean different things when they say that. I think that if Romney was pressed on it, he'd say, well, what I mean is I want to have equal rules for everyone, and I want them to be applied equally, and I want everyone to have the same opportunity to pursue their happiness and their economic well-being. Whereas I think Obama does mean more literally, we need to level the playing field. We need to start looking at outcomes and making sure that there aren't so many outcomes up here and so many down here, but closer in. But I think that there's no doubt that this kind of language, Obama gains a lot more from using this phrase. I mean, it's really hard for people to argue against things like we want to level the playing field, we want everyone to have the same chance in life, we are for equal rights. These aren't really they're not very refutable claims. They're kind of, I mean, they're basically platitudes. I mean, they've got something in them, but they're mostly platitudes. But they also they sound good, and no one really wants to disagree with them. But they continually reinforce this belief in equality. And I don't know if there's a way of making. I mean, I think I'll tell you where I stand already. I vote Republican. I am Republican. I'm a partisan. I probably think a little more like a libertarian. And I think libertarians are very, very comfortable talking about liberty, even in the face of perhaps unequal outcomes. But Republicans still have, especially the ones that are trying to run for office, they still have an interest and a tendency to talk about equality in different ways. And like I said, maybe it's not even a very realistic suggestion, but part of me wonders if it wouldn't be better to try to move to a more liberty-centric rhetoric somehow. And I'm not sure I have all the answers to that, but just to find novel ways to evoke images of liberty when using political rhetoric. And one way to do this, I do think, to some extent, was going back to what I said earlier, is maybe to resist the urge to base all one's arguments on what works, on what has some sort of evidence of success, and in terms of government programs, I'm thinking right now, and insist that it will just work everywhere else. You know, clearly it's worked here. We want results. This got results. You should do it too. Instead, focus on different places, different situations, and maybe focus more on the dynamic quality of liberty as opposed to what really is a static quality of equality and of centralization. I mean, I don't know, I feel like somehow progressives today have come up with a label. They label themselves both as the party of equality and also the party of change, of hope and change, dynamism, doing stuff differently. These two things don't really go together. I mean, when we look at what Tocqueville is saying here, equality and centralization, the belief in equality leads to uniform legislation from a central power and uniform administration of that stuff. So we were talking, this is about making things more common, more uniform. And I don't really know how I don't exactly know how progressives get the hope and change moniker as well as the equality moniker. They seem to carry both of them with aplomb, and it doesn't really make sense. I mean, I'm sure part of this has to do with just the label of conservative. There's a certain, being conservative. I do think that libertarians and free marketeers who are this is talking about dynamism and change and constant no more, try to get rid of stagnation by continually doing things in a new way. This is not a conservative approach, but it still has a conservative label. Clearly, there are many different types of conservatives. They're all lumped together, and they all vote together in the Republican Party, and that's probably a big part of it. But anyway, I think I'm going a little too far into that. But my basic point is, if it's a good one, I don't know, is that I think that maybe there's some avenue in making the case that you can't have equality and progress and change that don't all work together, and that could be a certain way to argue things. And I think one way that liberty lovers might be able to open people's eyes or encourage, well, I don't want to use that phrase, but encourage people about decentralization, about liberty, is the excitement of it. Using states as laboratories, using local communities as laboratories, using small things where people are, small communities, small issues, where there are people working together and doing things in very different ways. And even if it doesn't work, you know what, you gave it a shot, and you're learning as you go. All central government policies, whether it's socialism, communism, or even or less than that, has shown to be stagnant over time. Yes, it might be really effective and efficient for a while if the central government is running things and it's doing it in a very uniform way and standardizing everything, but it has been shown historically not to work forever. And so maybe just not focusing on what works, but also what's good for people in terms of self-government, in terms of working together. And I think that liberty lovers are fundamentally for that. And maybe it doesn't always come out in the rhetoric. So okay, I think that's it for me. But I'd love to take any questions or comments, or it doesn't have to be any question for me. One thing I do want to say before I do that is that I do suffer from some hereditary hearing loss, so bear with me if I ask you to repeat yourself or speak up.
I'd like to ask you if you've considered an additional element in the concentration of power and centralization, and that is size. The larger an entity or an organization grows, the more inclination it will have to centralize and try to have the centralized control. So have you looked at how you begin to break that apart so that the focus is not on every issue or question that comes up? The focus is not on a national solution, but more in the direction you ended on, around local, small government, or smaller entities.
David, can you, for the video, repeat or summarize the question?
Oh, yes, of course. So I hope I summarized your question well enough. But I think the question is, when large entities, whether it could be a business or whatever, but certainly a large central government, the larger it gets, there's a natural tendency to take over more. The bigger it is, the bigger the country is, you would think there'd be a greater chance of this happening. And I think that's a very good question. I don't have a great answer for it, but I will say that there's a difference between the Republican government that the American founders espoused and, let's say, more ancient Republican government. This means like Rome, places like Rome. Both big places, but the difference with America is it's so geographically big that the American founders said, okay, I'm going to try to be brief, but here, the one difference is this. Old republicanism, they literally believed that the political life was the best life for every person. The best life you can have is being part of the political community, being a very active participant. Of course, one thing you have to recognize is there are only very few citizens, the ones who owned land. They had tons of slaves who did everything for them. They had all this time to do all this political stuff and be out debating, doing this and that. The American founders were also Republicans, and they kind of followed in that tradition from Rome. But they realized it's not going to be like this anymore. Not in a country as big as America, and not in modern times with democracy. But what they did want to retain that idea of self-government. They just wanted to make it, let's say, plausible, possible, given the size of it. And one way of doing that was you're not going to have great, huge debates about the nature of man, or something like that, or what is true art, what is religion like they did in ancient Rome. It's more, we need to have people involved in small things. We need to have people involved in local education, in parks. I mean, I'm sure many people in this room are more familiar with this stuff and actually have real life experience with it. I'm trying to pull examples out of my head, but just all kinds of small local issues that local government can't take care of. That's what they wanted to focus on, and I think that's what Tocqueville wanted to focus on because of the issue you bring up. There's just no way to have huge debates about how you're going to govern at every little local community. You still have to have some kind of superstructure at the top. So I guess I guess that my answer to the question is, if it doesn't seem like it's a very good one right now, is that really on small local level things, try to retain as many of those as possible. And in a big country like this, be realistic about it, know that it's not going to be, you're not going to have one state that's socialist and one state that's free market. There's no free trade across one. But, I mean, I guess you could, but yeah, so I think I'm running in circles. But more potential things that are small is what he's focusing on.
I wonder if we don't already have a blueprint for that in the difference between the states and the national government. And in our states, in a sense, you can look at them as a much smaller microcosm of a central government. And we have our municipalities, all sorts of special districts, improvement districts, cities, and this and that. And there's a difference between each one. And they're not all the same, despite the tendency of Walmart and McDonald's and everywhere for all these areas. But I mean, that's really where the diversity and each state being its own laboratory for experimenting with anything they wanted to experiment with, from California to North Dakota. I mean, that provided diversity as well as the umbrella protection, so that everyone could kind of do their own thing as much as possible. We're losing that steadily in the national government because of what you're and de Tocqueville were talking about, this centralization.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And do you want me to try to
The best you
summarize
can.
that?
The best you can.
So this gentleman, I don't think asked a question, but brought up the very important point that it really, there is some hope against this natural tendency to centralize, because we do have a state system and they're not all the same, and there is some decentralization here, and that's exactly why Tocqueville thought that America had a chance. And I will say that I really think that's what he thought. He thought it had a chance. He didn't think, oh, it's good, they fixed it. Yeah, great, they figured it out, those founders are brilliant, and it's going to be great. He thought, oh, it's actually got a chance of fighting this tendency. And and states being laboratories, and that's why he places such emphasis on legislative decentralization and making sure you keep that in. And any constitutional issue that tries to take that away or threatens that would be, issue number one for Tocqueville, and I think should be for a lot of us.
Well, I think you can see when you have a big company how they have the top-down sort of structure, and they also get static, and which is why you see the small businesses coming up with most of the innovation. And I think you can make this argument for capitalism too. It's why it works, because capitalism is progressive and socialism is static.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. Is that as Susan here said, the nature of capitalism is constantly changing. It's progressive, never letting itself stay one way, and always changing. And yeah, I think that's very right. And Tocqueville actually doesn't. He really. I have to say it's been a couple of years since I wrote this paper, but I was really into Tocqueville back then, and I'm trying to remember some passages he wrote in Democracy in America. He really predicts capitalism, but he also predicts a bureaucratic kind of check on it, that the government's always going to be trying, in major industries, there's always going to be this, he almost predicts like, oh, there's going to be a new arm of bureaucracy that takes on renewable energy, for example. Like capitalism's going to bring up these new things all the time, and the minute they do, the minute they come up with something good, there's going to be some bureaucratic arm conceived and implemented or developed to be the final word on that innovation. And he definitely thinks this is a bad thing. But
there are reasons for big companies not to fail. Of course, we see that fail is the exact opposite. You want to let them fail because that.
Right. Yeah. Just let them die. It's not.
Right.
And that's why it's what's so hard to make. And that's why I said that maybe what I'm talking about, maybe a different sort of rhetoric, is a bit of a pipe dream. Is you just can't imagine Mitt Romney, and it would be bad for him. You just know it would happen if he would have said, no. What I was saying is just let General Motors die. Just let it die. Let it go. You just can't say it. It's just political suicide. But really, that's what I think I don't know him. That's what I'd want to say. And I think that's what a lot of people would want to say. But you really can't say it.
A number of things, but in your last comment, I think you're belittling Romney in the failure, letting GM fail. You go into a bankruptcy, and you take the good pieces, and you continue them on, and otherwise I don't necessarily think you can say that. But going back to your chart and you talk for all, are we not moving into an equality of tyranny? Everybody is suppressed down to the same level.
Wait, is that what he is saying? Is that or
he would have been 2 generations after the tyranny of the Directorate in France in the 1790s.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and the Directorate, it was freedom, equality, and fraternity, and you cannot have freedom and equality.
No. Well, no, that's an interesting question. So, gentleman makes the statement that in France, the monarchy was supposedly overthrown on the basis of equality and liberty and freedom, but you can't have both of those.
Under the slogans.
Yes. Okay. But one thing I want to say is in Democracy in America, no, the old regime. I'm sorry. What his final what's the word? He writes a little summary at the end of the book that says, this is what I'm saying. Synopsis, and it's kind of like a political statement like, listen up, French people, because this is what actually happened. He says, what I tried to prove in this book is that the regime that is going to follow the monarchy, who we all thought of as this big despot, is actually more despotic, more controlling, and more has its fingers in more things than the monarchy ever did. And that's a big point is too. Yeah, you can't have equality and freedom, and we've gone way too far. And he really doesn't think. He actually says that the revolution was the final stamp on equality in France, not liberty. So Tocqueville's take was the revolution did finally finish the job of equality and centralization winning in France, and that liberty had been left behind. Does that answer your question,
I would argue it's the revolution was just the opposite. When you went from equality of the High Middle Ages to the Louis XIV thing that I am the state to the revolution, it's everybody is equally suppressed, yes, but
well, that's true. But certainly the nobles who had and the landed gentry weren't, right? They still had their land. They had pretty much free reign to govern their own lands as they wished.
yeah, until come the revolution, and then everything was controlled from
Right, but
Paris.
which is true. But what Tocqueville's saying is that process started 200 years before the revolution, and it was just this expansion of government power. And so when the revolution happened, even though ostensibly, the political climate was, yeah, we're doing this for liberty and equality and fraternity, Tocqueville's saying, no, that's not it at all. All this is like the last straw, because what had been happening for 200 years prior was everything had been taken away, the class distinctions had been blurred, everything had been taken away from people governing on their own, and equality and centralization had prevailed, more or less. Is that? I'm not sure I'm understanding. I thought that's bad.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, we agree that
Okay.
the central government, or the central government of Paris, the monarchy, was becoming more and more and more powerful.
Right.
But I'm saying that you lose, the vertical stuff. You lose. Yes, you have maybe equality, but it's all equality of subjugation as that thing progresses, that timeline progresses.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, what Tocqueville fears with this cycle so much is that ultimately what you get is equal suppression. Yes, it's equality for all, but it's equal suppression. And he talks about mild despotism. What he says is that in places like America, what we have to worry about, we're not going to have, a tyrannical king that comes and plants us down, or a tyrannical leader. But what we will have is this kind of slow-moving, seemingly harmless move towards a centralizing power that's just as despotic in the long run. It just doesn't seem as bad. It just doesn't seem as bad. And it's slow. So he calls it, in terms of that, mild despotism. And I think that's probably
Well, the end result, yes.
Sorry?
The end result on this side, yes, we agree on that.
Yeah, right.
You were kind of talking about the different rhetoric that the Democrats have taken on with equality. And you talked about turning it more towards liberty and having kind of a language out there focused more on liberty. And I would say that there's also kind of a control of that when Romney at the last debate talked about freeing up regulations and stuff like that to allow entrepreneurs to do things. The immediate response was, well, that's what got us into the problem beforehand. So I think liberty is often equated with lack of regulation. And I think that's something that's to be espoused to if you have self-regulation, which our society seems to be pretty much without. And so I think bringing back some of that self-regulation could bring about more of that liberty that you're looking to find. But I think that's the quality that needs to be brought back, is the element of self-regulation. And greed has gone rampant when you get the big companies who are lying and cheating and stealing just to make more money. And so I guess I'm just making a statement about liberty has to be couched in a self-regulatory framework if it's to work.
Yeah, so the gentleman just had a very good idea that maybe a new language of liberty would have to be couched somehow in an idea of self-regulation, or at least local self-regulation, something, yes, smaller scale regulation. Yeah, no, that seems like it'd make a lot of sense. I mean, and I think Tocqueville would agree with that too, but also it's like there can be a tendency, the kind of straw man is, for progressive or Democrats, is that, oh, when you're talking about liberty, it's just anarchy, let the strong kill the weak, let the blah, and you're like, no, that's not at all. Liberty and anarchy are very different things. And in the academic world, in the philosophic world, there's, tons and tons of papers written about the difference between those two things. And one, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the big schools of thought is that liberty, what true liberty is self-regulation or self-legislation. Making your own laws yourself and following your own laws. That's true liberty. Just being completely anarchic is, I don't know what that is. It's anarchy. But it's not. That's not what liberty is. And that's interesting. I mean, I think the point you make is really good, and I wonder how you. I mean, maybe if you could get like some good punchlines and slogans around that, that would seem really effective. But,
yeah, it seems to me that the self-regulation has to be based on some system of moral and ethical behavior or grounding. So now you need to decide, where does that come from?
Yeah. So the question is, you have to have some sort of moral, ethical structure to have liberty at all. And where is that going to come from if not the state? Is that the question?
Well, no, I'm saying that the self-regulation has to be based on some type of moral or ethical standards or philosophy.
That's true. So self-regulation has to be based on some sort of moral foundations or philosophy. But you could also say that you might have different systems of ethics and philosophy and morals and still be self-regulating according to those principles, let's say, but they could be very different. To use a shocking example, like Marilyn Manson might have some principles that he actually follows. Like, he's not a complete nut where he's just completely random and does everything crazily. He's got some consistency to his behavior, even if it's objectionable to most people. But you could argue that he self-regulates and Mother Teresa self-regulates as well. But they're both, maybe enacting their own liberty in that way.